Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Season 2 of the channel. It is now 2021. I apologize for the some 3 months I have been inactive. I'm currently in the midst of midterms for college, and needless to say, learning history all day and then writing more history for YouTube is not like the best mix. Anyways, it's almost summer, so I thought I would make a short video. Today we are talking about a real interesting period of recent history. I did not find a single video on the war, and it's a Balkan war, so let's get into it. I know I sound excited, but of all the Balkan wars, this is really quite calm. People lost their lives, but so many more were saved. The year was 1980. Yugoslavia had been in a post-war period of immense communist reforms. Joseph Tito attempted to unite the Balkans through communism, and compared to other leaders, he was rather successful. However, Tito passed in 1980, and with his death saw the death of a leader with enough authority to oppress the non-Serbian Balkan countries. Quickly, ethnic, religious, and economic tensions emerged. Some were as old as the Balkans themselves, others were manufactured to fill the void of culture the Balkans had been forced to encounter for hundreds of years under the boots of numerous empires. Furthermore, the period after Tito's death was full of instability. Each republic or modern country had their own president, and this complicated web of leaders created further reason for national autonomy. However, in 1989, Slobodan Milosevic became the president of Serbia. Serbia was like the quote-unquote capital of Yugoslavia, and thus further division grew. Serbia now had a pro-Serbian communist in power. Thus, angry at Milosevic for his consolidation of Serbian power, Slovenia knew it had to leave Yugoslavia. And when they managed democratic elections in April of 1990, the Demos center-right Democratic Party won. Later that year, in December, a referendum was held within Slovenia. 93% of the country voted. The electorate voted 88.5% in favor of independence, guaranteeing that Slovenia was ready to be free. So, with this wild decade-long summary out of the way, this is the story of the Slovenian 10-Day War. Immediately after this referendum, Belgrade, the capital of Yugoslavia, announced a defense doctrine that would apply to all of Yugoslavia. In layman's terms, Belgrade could intervene when the country's stability seemed threatened. This was a Tito-era ideal, and only made Slovenia and other Balkan countries more upset. Now, any independent form of defense would be under the ownership of the JNA, aka the Yugoslavian National Army. Because of this declaration of independence, Yugoslavia stripped all Slovenian military independence. So the Slovenian government activated a new command structure, known as the Maneuver Structures of National Protection, or MSNZ. It basically established a Slovenian military. It had already existed, but under the boot of the JNA. The Slovenian government previously had the Territorial Defense Force, but they were quickly taken in Belgrade. And in Slovenia, the defense force just evolved into the MSNZ. It's all very confusing. Just know Slovenia made the MSNZ as their new military force against the Yugoslavian JNA. So how many territorial defense personnel joined the MSNZ? Well, some 21,000, including all their military equipment, command, and their pre-existing defense plans against the JNA. And the Yugo government had absolutely no clue what happened. So the total Slovenes numbered some 35,000 military forces, mostly made up of those territorial defense forces, alongside some 10,000 policemen. But of course, even though this small country may seem like it had a fair amount of troops, the Yugoslavians had thousands more in total. So the MSNZ knew that they had to fight a war of attrition. Their plan was quite simple. Hold out in the mountains with anti-tank and anti-air guns and ambush the presumable armored JNA columns that would enter Slovenia. The Slovenes had SA-7 Grail anti-aircraft missiles and German arm-burst anti-tank systems. So just like the wars in Afghanistan, the high mountains and tight roads made the hit-and-run tactic especially effective. The JNA, along really any large government, used tanks amidst an internal conflict. This is probably just a scare tactic, like in the Hungarian revolts, but in this case, the tanks had no defense against the top-of-the-line AT rounds coming down from the Smoky Alps. Moving forward, Slovenia officially declared independence on the 25th of June 1991, one day before it said it would. Funnily enough, This one-day gap caught Yugoslavia completely off guard, and the Slovenes mobilized a full 24 hours before the Yugoslavian troops were prepared to move out. Surprisingly, not a single UN or US ally supported Slovenian independence. As surprising as it sounds, with our modern context of the Balkan Wars, Yugoslavia kept the Balkans united. It seemed it was more beneficial than multiple countries warring it out over independence. But the Slovenes had no other option or time to wait for independence. They knew this was the fragility they needed to strike. This weird independence of Slovenia really stirred the inner politics of not only the West, but Yugoslavia. Many politicians within Yugoslavia thought of different ways to handle Slovenia. In the inevitable collapse of Yugoslavia, the defense minister wanted to show out force, and the JNA chief of staff wanted to use the entire force of the JNA to steamroll the Slovenes. This may seem similar, but the defense minister's show of force idea was chosen, and in my opinion, this decision cost them Slovenia. Like I previously stated, the JNA thought rolling in tanks would scare off the Slovenes, when in reality the Slovenes were hiding in the mountains with high-tech anti-tank launchers. Needless to say, the Slovenes' underground operations completely surprised the JNA. The JNA's incompetency was not entirely because of their lack of command. It must be noted that Slovenia really never was this close to the other Balkan countries. It served very little purpose to Yugoslavia. So with Croatia and Bosnia ready to commit genocide and blow up Yugoslavia, the JNA had different things to worry about. Also, two side notes just to point out. The Slovene head of government was pretty much left out of the planning by the MSNZ. This was not really a military Slovenian junta, but I guess some parallels can be drawn. Also, most of the JNA forces that were sent to respond were ordered just to scare off Slovenes, and most of the divisions were just local Croatian Home Guard units, who were also planning independence themselves. So, luckily for the Slovenes, they were not facing the quote-unquote true Yugoslavian military, although this may get some commenters upset. Anyways, let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. The war officially began the day after declaration, so on the 26th of June. In the early hours of the morning, the Yugoslav People's Army 13th Corps left their base in Rijeka in Croatia. The Croatian-based JNA units were practically tasked with cutting off the border crossings Slovenia had with Italy, and later on the JNA targeted the Austrian border. Either way, the local Slovenes barricaded the borders as the tanks rolled in. There was no death, but just a lot of protesting, marching, and general disruption against the JNA invasion. The Slovene government knew the importance of border crossings. It was their only connection to the outside world. Thus, Slovenia seized the border posts and international airport at Brnik. Most of the Brnik area just surrendered and joined the Slovenes. They were Slovene after all, so why fight? This is the case for much of the JNA protected bases and border crossings within modern Slovene lands. They just surrendered and joined their Slovene brothers. Thus, the entirety of the Slovenian borders were now occupied by not only JNA troops, but the new Slovene converts. It would now be up to the JNA to remove these border guards, which obviously would result in killings, which obviously for the media would not be the best look for the JNA. So as the JNA started pushing into Slovenian border crossings with Italy, it was faced mostly with just protesters. Meanwhile, the Slovenes were also taking over border crossings, waiting for the inevitable attacks. This took the entirety of the first day. Alright, so now let's get into the second day. So the second day saw further mobilization by both the JNA and the subsequent response by the new Slovenian government. For now, Slovenia focused all efforts on taking the border crossings and airports who had either JNA within them or they were being targeted by the JNA. In the first hours of the new day, word came in of the potential use of helicopters by the JNA. The JNA's 5th Military Command in Zagreb had the potential and seemed like it was willing to utilize special troops to drop off troops at special Slovene locations. With major fears of this potential aerial invasion, the Slovenes stated that they would shoot down any JNA helicopters. Immediately, 2 helicopters were spotted over the capital and were shot down using the aforementioned SA-7 anti-air missiles. Both were destroyed. One of the helicopters, most likely a French-made Gazelle, was piloted by a Slovene pilot, making the first casualty of a Slovene killing a Slovene. This really echoes the harsh reality of the Balkan Wars. So as the JNA charged into major border crossings and airports, small firefights erupted. In Brnik, 4 JNA soldiers were shot by a unit of Slovene forces who lost one of their own. By midnight, the JNA had steamrolled the entire length of the Italian border. Only 3 crossings with Austria remained in Slovene control. This brings us to day 3. The day started with evacuation plans for the civilians and the start of a Slovene offensive. This offensive was active immediately, and shortly JNA tank columns were coming under fire. Meanwhile, Slovenian special forces were destroying multiple JNA T-55 tanks, destroying 3 and capturing 3 more. Altogether, these forces killed 4 JNA soldiers and captured 100. Soon after, the border crossings at Holmek was captured, with around 2 Slovene casualties, 3 dead JNA, and 91 captured JNA. In retaliation, the Yugoslav Air Force started bombing truck routes, killing multiple truck columns, and killing civilians at the Brnik airport. The Air Force conducted a fair amount of strikes, attempting to silence any radio broadcasts out of fear of further Slovene mobilization. The Yugo air power failed to help the border crossings, who were rapidly being taken by the Slovenes. JNA units either surrendered or just changed patches and joined the Slovenes. Now on to day 4. From here, things will go pretty quick, so keep up. The Slovenes continued to dominate the JNA holdings along the border crossings and major JNA strongholds, such as the one at Brnik Airport, which was taken by the MSNZ. Soon enough, entire tank companies were surrendering and being used by the MSNZ. JNA special forces tried to establish a foothold in Slovenia's small coast, but failed. As the Slovenes quickly captured hundreds of troops, equipment, and tanks, they were able to enlarge their forces. We have only seen a small number of this, but in total, the war resulted in 4,693 captured JNA forces out of their total 22,000 total force. Meanwhile, Slovenia managed to gather around 35,000 soldiers altogether. Casualties were rather similar, around 150 wounded. The JNA announced that Slovenia must stop all hostilities, but Slovenia kept fighting. Slovenia continued to capture key points along the border for the entirety of the 5th day, including 5 more tanks. The 6th day, an enormous JNA ammo dump caught fire and blew up much of the town. With these losses, the JNA changed up their entire plan. Now the JNA knew scaring off the MSNZ and taking borders wouldn't work, so they planned a full-scale invasion, but Serbian officials declined. The 7th day only brought further destruction of the JNA. An entire tank column was halted under fire. Any attempted breakthrough from Croatia was met with heavy Slovene resistance, and the Slovenes captured even more border crossings. Fighting on this day was extremely fierce, and Slovenia soon announced a ceasefire, but the JNA continued attempts at taking land back. By the 8th day, the JNA was slugging along. Thus, Belgrade sent a large convoy for Slovenia. This enormous lump of Yugo power never made it before the end of the war, but if it did, it could have changed the result. Looking back, because of Croatia's continuing resistance during this period, it seems sending enormous tank divisions through Croatia would only make a future war against Croatia more difficult. So, on the 9th day, with losses and poor supply, Slovenia took the last of the JNA border crossings, and a ceasefire was met. All JNA forces were allowed to return back to their homes in Croatia and beyond. The 10th day included the Brioni Accord, which was signed on a Croatian island. The terms ended the war, with Slovenia granted independence and sovereignty, as well as their homeland. Unfortunately for the JNA, much of their tanks and other weapons were left in Slovenia, with many of these munitions sent to Croatia during their own War of Independence. Overall, this may seem as a pretty unimportant war to us, and maybe it should be, but at the same time, I think it tells the story of all wars, in that this was a war against brother. Nobody really wanted to fight it, henceforth why thousands surrendered. This was the case for much of the Balkan Wars. Unlike the others, lack of foreign intervention prevented much of the NATO bombings that killed thousands in the other wars. Oftentimes this is summarized as Yugoslavia just didn't care about Slovenia. But I think Yugoslavia did care about Slovenia. But Croatia made up most of the men in contact with the Slovenes, resulting in the weakness. Overall, I think at this moment we can learn that Yugoslavia just did not have the authority to tell Croats to kill Slovenes for Serbian benefit. Anyways, this video took some time to make, so make sure to show support if you thought it was interesting. Hopefully if you watch this in the future, you can respect the war and understand the complications within it. And yeah, I hope you learned something now.